Hey guys, how are you all? Welcome to Let's Start Story on What If Naruto Had Secret Harem with Georgia in Pokemon Universe. So do 4 blue hearts. Comment, be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video, and please share with your friends and watch till end. Also check out Patreon, for I have upload Naruto X Rias and Akino uncensored spicy version, link in description. It was another fine day for the people of the Village of Dragons. It was nice and sunny, with very few clouds overhead, and the humidity was at a low, so it wasn't muggy and make everything a challenge to do. For the small population of the village, it was run like many of the smaller villages across the world, where it was the elders that ran the village, making sure everyone was alright and nobody was breaking the rules within the village. One of the rules being that ice-type Pokemon were not allowed in the Village of Dragons. Some of the people were about selling their homemade wares that were set up just outside of their humble abodes. The small community that housed about a few dozen people meant that everyone knew everyone, and everyone was on friendly terms with each other. Sure, there were a few squabbles, it generally didn't lead to something major. However, due to the location of the Village of Dragons, it seemed like a paradise to most who were allowed to enter, or those lucky enough to be born within the village itself. The sheer scale of the village and its surroundings made it very easy for the Pokemon and humans to coexist with each other and not risk anything happening. Besides, it was mainly the Pokemon that lived within the forested area or were located near one of the 2 major river systems in the village. However, to the northernmost part of the village is where things got a little tense for the elders. In the northernmost part of the village, a mountain lies on the border of the village. Not just any mountain. It was an icy mountain that was one of the largest in all of Unova, and due to its icy and snowy nature, the more stricter and the ones that were avid followers of the rules set by the elders never stepped within 100 feet of the mountain range. It also meant that the snow that would fall upon the mountain would drift down to the northernmost part of the village, blanketing it in a rather thick layer of snow. It was also the fact that ice-type Pokemon resided within the immediate area. Sure, they were small baby ice-type Pokemon, but due to their nature and lovers of dragon-type Pokemon, it made most of the people a little fearful for the creatures. However, that was not all that the mountain range made people a little weary of. It was for the fact that on the other side of the mountain range, the Village of Ice was located. For as long as the village had been around, which happened to be a long time, the Village of Ice was an arch-nemesis to each other. Almost like 2 different sides in a war. Unlike the Village of Dragons, where the people feared ice-type Pokemon, the people of that village loved those ice-type Pokemon to death, and they also loved becoming Dragon Busters. Which meant that it was their goal to battle and defeat as many trainers that had Dragon-type Pokemon with their ice types, and hopefully, they can be regarded in the village's history of the best Dragon Buster that ever lived. However, today would be the day that the village would be rocked to its very core. Ah, where am I? A small child murmured to himself as he gazed around at his surroundings. And frowned lightly when he saw that everything basically looked the same. It was something that baffled his young mind, as he only really took his eyes off his surroundings for a minute at most, yet during this amount of time, he had lost Iris, his best friend, and had somehow strayed off the pathways that had been made to allow people to follow for a nice nature walk. The small boy in question stood at about 4 feet 2. And had bright yellow blonde, spiky hair, which he inherited from his father, along with rather bright blue eyes, something he also inherited from his father, while he inherited the shape of his mother's eyes and even the shape of his face. However, the main standout feature that Naruto had were the 3 whisker markings on either cheek. Discover more. Pokemon. Fishcake. Pokemon. World-building guides, books. Fanfiction conventions, passes. Bookshelves. Character design tools. Creative writing journals. Writing contests entry. Video game guides. It was also common knowledge that Naruto seemed to inherit the perfect mixture of facial features from both of his parents, and he often got the statement that he was going to grow up to be a fine young lad. While he did enjoy the remarks at first, it did get kinda annoying listening to the same compliment for the 20th time. He had a rather normal build for a kid his age, and he wore a simple white shirt that was a little long lengthwise. And also had a print of a Ninetales on it. Yes, he also did have a fascination with fox-like Pokemon, and he also wore a simple pair of green shorts that came down to his knees. Like most in his village, he walked around barefoot, as it felt more natural to him, and he felt more connected with nature when he walked around barefoot. Frowning lightly as he saw the beginnings of an snowy path ahead. He must have walked a bit too close towards the mountain range. Huh. Blinking in confusion as he swore he heard another voice, he gazed around, a confused expression marring his face as he took a few steps in every which way to try and pinpoint where that sound had come from. It's over there. Naruto called out, mostly to himself. Equal amounts of curiosity and concern in his voice. He was alone, and in a pretty large forest, which happened to be inhabited by many different Pokémon. His parents had drilled it into him that not all Pokémon were friendly or even that understanding of humans, so it was possible that they will attack if they feel threatened or had that sort of personality. Discover more. Fishcake. Pokémon. Online writing platform. Novel writing software. Literary analysis books. Story writing tools. Comic book subscriptions. Pen and paper sets. Digital story templates. As he tentatively made his way over towards the pile of shrubbery that he heard the noise come from, he once again heard that noise, and because he was so close, he could hear that whatever it was that was behind the shrubbery was in pain, and it sounds like a great deal of pain as well. Only it was trying to keep its voice down to try and not bring attention to itself. Taking a deep breath, Naruto gently grabbed onto some of the larger dead branches and leaves that were covering the shrubbery and gently parted it, finally able to peer at what was hiding behind it. However, what he saw made him blink in confusion. It was a small, black Pokémon with an ovoid body. It has circular, light blue eyes, wide teeth, and spherical hands and feet that lack digits. It is covered with a yellow cloak that gives it a triangular outline. The coat is rimmed with an orange stripe and has 3 orange diamond markings on the back. However, the Pokémon was littered with cuts and scratches that looked rather nasty. It also seemed to be just a little smaller than the others belonging to its species. Naruto knew that this Pokémon was a Snorunt, and he knew for a fact that it lived within the mountain range up ahead. The reason why he knew this. It was because, say in one of the few school terms that the village had, the children were taken on a class field trip towards the snowy mountain range, learning about the ice-type Pokémon that lived there. It was a time when one of the more close-minded teachers, that had borrowed an Embor for protection from one of the elders, taught them in how to either avoid the ice-type Pokémon, along with giving them advice in how to take care of them. It was rather brutal for Naruto to witness such a large Pokémon to take down the much smaller and friendlier-looking ice-type Pokémon with such efficiency and brutality. Seriously. Huhav Embor was a move called Heat Crash, a move that is more powerful that takes the weight of the Pokémon into consideration, against one of the cutest Pokémon around, a poor little Cubchoo. Discover more. Pokémon. Fishcake. Pokémon. Creative writing journals. Community forum software. Novel writing software. Audiobook creation services. Books. Character design tools. Story writing tools. When Naruto had reported back to his parents about what he had witnessed, they had quickly taken him out of the schooling program, calling the people there simple-minded morons, not that he was to repeat that to anyone, and started homeschooling him on days when they weren't busy. Discover more. Pokémon. Fishcake. Pokémon. Online writing communities memberships. Fan art commissions. Bookshelves. Play script downloads. Fanfiction merchandise clothing. Crossover story guides. Beta reader services. Shaking his head from those thoughts, Naruto carefully made his way over to the injured Snorunt, hoping that having his hands up and taking small steps towards the Pokémon will be enough to have it settle down. Unlike most occupants in the Village of Dragons, Naruto didn't hate ice-type Pokémon, he actually liked them. He found them cute, yet he also knew that they were powerful if they were treated with care and love. They also had a little inclination to perform practical jokes on people. They weren't harmful by any means. But it did cause a few laughs to happen. Hello. Naruto called out softly. Snow. Ru. As expected, the injured Snorunt was a little spooked when its attention was turned towards Naruto. Its circular, light blue eyes almost widening to the size of a dinner plate as its tiny little legs carried it backwards, almost making it topple over due to its injuries to uneven weight distribution. It's alright. I'm not going to hurt you. Naruto said softly, before extending the back of his hand towards the Pokémon in a careful manner. His parents had told him that using the back of one's hand gives the Pokémon some sort of comfort, due to the back of the hand being unable to harm them in any way. Like if one would use the palm of their hand, one could easily slap, grab or hit the Pokémon. With the back of the hand, that is very hard to achieve, so it gives the Pokémon, or animal, the innate comfort to approach. At first, the Snorunt eyed the back of his hand like it was a plague to itself, however. Naruto was not deterred in the slightest. So, he kept his hand in the same position, only changing the way he was postured to make it easier on his hand that was getting a little tired from being held up, so he was using his knee as a sort of arm rest. Seeing the human in front of it have that persistence keep up, even when she has thoroughly ignored the Huma. Enter sent menacing glares in its eyes, yet, even after all of that, all the human had really done was change his position, and was now using his body as some sort of rest for his arm. At first, she had expected it to be another one of those humans or ignored her, or were going to take care of her in her weakened state. It had already happened in her short time of life. She was a little untrusting towards anyone, fellow Pokémon. Whether they be those pesky dragons that were always itching for a fight, or even her fellow ice-type Pokémon. Ever since she had been cast out of her family due to her small stature, and they had been unwilling to even look after her after a certain point in her life, so she had been left all alone in the massive world, fighting for every scrap of food that she could, yet, it had been a lot for her. Due to her weak moves, she wasn't able to protect herself from the other, stronger Pokémon or those annoying humans that always showed up whenever she was about to eat from one of berries from the trees. It hadn't helped since she had just ran away from another human that was chasing her with a rather large and ferocious beast, and it even landed a hit on her, forcing her to run away and cower with her injuries. Yet, this human boy didn't back down, and instead, seemed to be taking his time when it came to trying to approach Ru, keeping her eyes low, CKED onto the human in case he pulled a sneaky move. She tentatively approached his outstretched hand and gave it a small sniff, with his scent entering her senses, and he smelled of the forest and dew. She was rather surprised that when she went a bit further with her prodding, she could smell or sense no malicious intent within him. Instead, he seemed to give off this aura that made her feel warm and protected even. She liked that feeling. It was something that she hadn't felt in a long time. Going a step further, she leaned into his hand, rubbing her body along the back of his hand. Naruto felt positively giddy once the Snorunt had placed enough trust in him to lean against the back of his hand. He also noted that this was the first wild Pokémon that he actually managed to touch. Sure, he had touched his parents' Pokémon, and even a few more tamed ones that belonged to the elders, but this was the first time that he himself had managed to touch a wild Pokémon without having it attack him. Sure, it was a little aggressive to begin with, but that was only because its instincts were keeping it on guard. "Aren't you a cute little guy?" he murmured out, feeling comfortable not to bring his other hand out and gently run that along the body of the Snorunt. He was surprised to see that the Snorunt seemingly glared at him, and gave a rather annoyed cry of, "Snow! Snow!" Chuck, clinging nervously at the actions of the Snorunt, he quickly apologized, "Sorry." Before adding on, "You're a girl?" he questioned softly. Runt, smiling softly towards the Snorunt, which he knew was a male now, as it nodded its tiny little stubs for hands went up into the air as it cheered its name out multiple times. However, his smile soon turned into a frown as he noticed that she was still struggling with some injuries that she had received prior to finding her. "Hey. I know you might not trust me, but do you want to come back home with me?" he questioned softly, continuing to rub the Pokémon gently. "Snow." She tilted her head at that, her icy blue eyes narrowed in confusion, but Naruto could see another emotion lingering deep within. "I know it's against the rules and I could get into big trouble. But we do have medical supplies at home, where I can help treat you to your injuries," he added on, looking at the Pokémon directly in its eyes. He hoped that the Pokémon would agree so he could help it. He never really liked seeing Pokémon injured, and the vivid images of what Embor did to that poor Cubchoo was still fresh in his mind. He was honestly surprised that a Pokémon small survived a brutal attack like that. As Naruto gave the offer to the Snowrunt, he waited until she decided on what to do. If she decided to come with him, then he would carry her to his home, and do his best to hide her from the other people of the village. However, if she decided to not come with him, then he would rush back to his home and bring the medical supplies here. He just had to make sure that Snowrunt stayed where she was or stay in the general area. However, he was broken out of his thoughts when he noticed that Snowrunt nodded her head, before gingerly taking a step on his outstretched hand. She was small enough that she could simply sit on his hands when he brought his second one underneath to help with the sudden addition of weight that had come from her position. "Thank you. I promise that I will take care of you," he murmured out, flashing a small smile towards the Snowrunt resting in his arms. "Now, to get home and avoid the others," he muttered out. He knew that he was still lost within the forest, and it might take him a while before he could even find his way back home, but he was willing to take as long as he could now that he had the Snowrunt as his responsibility. He just hoped that she would stay with him and hopefully give a small amount of directional input, since it would be likely that she knew her way around the forest better than he did. It had been a day since Naruto had snuck the injured Snowrunt back from the forest, and back to his house. He was very sure that nobody had spotted him on the way back, nor did anyone know that he was actually smuggling an ice-type Pokemon back into the village. Healing the Snowrunt of her injuries had taken a bit of time, but thankfully, the Snowrunt was patient with him. Sure, she was still wary of him, as she should, however. She was being amicable with him, as she had appreciated his efforts in healing him. He had found out the hard way that the Snowrunt was a female rather than a male when he had accidentally called her a him. A few bandages wrapped around her stubby little hands and some hyper potions gently sprayed along her, and within half of an hour, Snowrunt was looking fine, still a little tired and hungry from fear. But she looked completely fine. All she really needed was a rest to be near full health and stamina once again. However, what Naruto wasn't counting upon was for Hi's parents to return home from a little expedition early that day. He was under the impression that they would be gone for another few hours. At first, they didn't expect anything from him, apart from being a little curious as to why he was being a little more antsy than usual and always sending glances towards his bedroom, but they had let it go for Naruto imagining something. Yet, they knew something was up when they had noticed some bandage wrappings and a few empty bottles of hyper potions laying about. At first, they were a little mad at him for using those supplies and probably wasting them. They weren't exactly cheap things, as they had to be imported from the nearest city, and that added a few hundred Pokédollars to the bill from the already expensive 1100 Pokédollar potions. However, once they saw the reason in why the supplies were used, they were a little more amicable, and despite the Pokémon that Naruto was nursing was Ice-type, they didn't hold the same hatred towards Ice-type Pokémon. They knew that this was risky what Naruto was doing, and if he was caught, it would lead into some serious trouble. They had allowed Naruto to keep the Snowrunt and continue to heal and nurse it back to health. After they made him promise that he wouldn't be caught holding the Pokémon, nor was he spotted playing with it. Instead, they had told him if he wants to play with the Snowrunt when it was able to, then it must be within the forest close to their home, out of sight from any prying eyes, and he couldn't speak a word about the Pokémon, not even to his friend Iris. Naruto had earnestly agreed to it, and thus, he became the temporary caretaker and friend of the injured Snowrunt. Despite only being together for a short amount of time, Naruto had grown fond of Snowrunt, and it was clear that Snowrunt had an attachment to him as well, going as far to sleep in the same bed as him. Minato and Kushina found it adorable, yet they were also under the impression that it was because Snowrunt only really knew Naruto, and thus was more comfortable with him when she slept. He had even nicknamed her, in which her new nickname, which she was greatly pleased about, was Miyuki. However, sadly, the secret that Naruto was keeping the Snowrunt within their home eventually got out, and Naruto was given a choice: release the Snowrunt, or hand the Pokémon over towards the elders, where they would deal with it, or face the consequences. Naruto had not given the Snowrunt away, nor was he releasing his Pokeball. So, he had chose the punishment, stating that he would never part with his Pr. ECIOUS Miyuki right to the rather grouchy elders' faces. So, they had administered the punishment of his actions. That punishment, Banishment from the village, much to the shock of the gathered people that were watching as some sort of public humiliation. Banishment of a small child, just because he had bonded with an ice-type Pokémon was barbaric, yet the elders would not be swayed. However, Minato and Kushina were unwilling to let their son be punished alone so harshly alone, so they too decided to leave the village with Naruto, being his parents, and with Kushina's saying being, family always comes first, always. She would stick with Naruto no matter what. Just to spite the village of dragons and the elders, Kushina, Minato and Naruto would head towards the far north, and make their new residency within the village of ice. Naruto tilde, are you awake? A rather teasing, yet sing-songy voice called out. Groaning lightly as he was awoken, rather rudely in his opinion, he groggily opened his eyes to see Georgia standing above him with her hands on her hips along with a rather teasing smirk on her face. I am now. He muttered out, his voice rather hoarse from just having woken up. Sitting up from his resting position, Naruto could idly see out of the corner of his eye that small rays of sunshine were starting to peel their way through the simple gray tent that he was sleeping in. And the flaps of the tent were still open due to the gentle wind, and he could see the briefest of outlines of the old campfire from last night. Yet, his attention was drawn to the person that had woke him up, who happened to be one of the few friends that he would be able to confidently call them close. The person in question was a girl with neck-length pink hair and rather bright teal eyes that were shining in amusement currently. She was currently wearing a long dark teal dress, underneath a teal blouse with yellow buttons. She was also wearing a pair of dark teal socks, teal boots with black heels, as well as a yellow cap nestled on her head and a pair of yellow gloves. Another interesting bit of fashion that she had was a small black collar that fit snugly around her neck. This was Georgia, someone who took a little to get used to with her rather overbearing personality and sense of humor, but once you got past that, she was a very loyal and kind friend. In fact, it was her family that guided them through the village of ice when they arrived for the first time, and ever since that, his parents and her parents were quiet close friends. This in turn, also meant that Naruto and Georgia saw each other a lot growing up, and that had sparked a very close friendship between them. It was also apparent very quickly growing up that Georgia seemed to have an affinity towards anything teal-colored, as seen by her choice of clothing she was currently wearing. Why did you wake me up so early? He questioned after stretching his body, which made his yawn sound a little more like a moan. Georgia simply scoffed, rolling her eyes at her best friend, and not-so-secret crush. It was very clear that he wasn't a fan of being woken up, nor was he that much of a morning person. Well, would you rather I wake you up, or allow Miyuki to do that for me? She retorted lightly, sending a glance towards the Pokémon in question. It still seemed that Frostlass was still having some snuggles with Naruto. How he didn't get bothered by the chill was beyond her, yet one of her eyes were open and it seemed like she was glaring at her. Like she was annoyed that she was woken up. Or she wasn't able to wake Naruto herself. Yes, she had come to terms with the fact that Frostlass was a rather unique Pokémon when it came to her bond with Naruto. On second thought, I am glad you woke me up, Naruto said quickly, thankful for at least a small mercy. Don't get him wrong, he loved to sleep, and of course, he loved Frostlass, maybe a little more than his other Pokémon. However, with Frostlass waking him up, it was something that gave him chills, literally, as she normally woke him up with a frost breath attack or sometimes even her draining kiss attack. Actually, that means she used draining kiss to wake him up, was technically his first kiss that wasn't from his parents. Thought so, Georgia stated, flashing a smile in his direction. Well, get up and change. We are nearly in the next city. And I would rather not spend another night in the wilderness, she added on, before leaving the tent and into the outside world. Sighing to himself, Naruto looked to his side. And he saw that Miyuki was trying her damned best to snuggle into him further, acting all innocent like she was asleep. Frostlass is a humanoid Pokémon with a hollow torso that resembles a kimono. It wears a red band around its waist, reminiscent of an obi. Its arms are connected to the sides of its head and flare at the wrists. The flared portion has a dappled light blue coloration. Its hands consist of 3 small fingers. Frostlass's head is shaped similar to a sideways water droplet and is topped with 2 ice crystals that resemble horns. Its head has several holes on it, resembling a mask. Through two of these holes, crystal blue eyes with yellow sclerae can be seen. It also has a mouth below this mask. To make his frostlass more unique compared to the other ones, she had small pink ribbons that gently wrapped around the ice crystals atop of her head. She was also pretty attached to the ribbons, always taking immaculate care of them and hardly letting them get damaged or dirtied. He knew better. He had fallen for that many times before. Come on, Miyuki. I know you're awake, he said, gently rubbing the top of her head, like he used to do when she was just an adorable little snowrunt. Lass, sorry. Miyuki, no more sleeping, he said, before rising from his sleeping bag, showing that he was only wearing a white singlet and some grayish-black briefs. We are meeting Iris in town soon, he added on, before heading towards the very edge of the tent and rummaging through his backpack that he carried around and took out a change of clothes. Unseized to Naruto, once Frostlass had heard Iris' name, she seemed to huff and glare at nothing at the top of the tent. It was clear that she had a disliking towards the energetic, chocolate-skinned girl that harbored feelings for her trainer. It was hard enough to have Georgia around her trainer, when it was clear that she too harbored feelings for her trainer. It annoyed her greatly. She was his most precious Pokemon, along with his partner. So, it should be her that was with him in that sort of way. She had come to terms long ago that she wouldn't be able to have any eggs with her precious trainer, so instead, she would be acting like the best there could ever be, just so she could be only one on his mind. It just wasn't fair for her. At least she liked Georgia more considering that she was also an ice-type trainer. Much better than Iris, who she loved to scare and spook whenever she could and use that fear of ice-type Pokemon against her. After getting changed, Naruto had enjoyed a nice breakfast that mainly consisted of some safe, edible berries from the trees and bushes, along with some breakfast bars that they had stocked up on when they were in the last town. While they were getting sick and tired of eating the same thing every morning, it did the job between the towns and cities of the region, so they really couldn't complain when it gave them the appropriate energy to continue with their day. Yet, now Naruto and Georgia had found themselves traveling down a dirt path that was rather wide and had some scenic points to it, the shrubbery bursting with berries, the small bird Pokemon flying about, and even a few Swadloon or Sawaddle spotted about as well, and in the far distance, they could see their destination inching ever so closer. The destination, Lacunosa town. Apparently, Iris had heard a rather well-known legend regarding the fortified town. Apparently, a long time ago, it was said that a large meteor came from the sky containing a terrifying monster, and shattered the land a few miles away from it, forming what is now known as the Giant Chasm today. Yet, the legend continues going on, stating that at night the monster would appear in the town, along with the cold winds and would take away both humans and Pokemon to eat them. Of course, Iris, being the rather adventurous person, had contacted him right away and invited him to investigate with her when she had learnt of this information. And she seemed genuinely intrigued by it, although the mentions of the cold winds did get her to shiver at the prospect of the monster being an ice-type Pokemon. Yet, with Georgia being Georgia, she was a rather intrusive person, and when she overheard Iris, her rival, in not only battle and typing, but in love as well, talking about it, she wanted to know more about it as well. Although she was more skeptical, she couldn't hide her interest at the legend. She also wanted to tag along, mainly to make sure that Iris wouldn't use this sort of thing to make an NCE on Naruto and be ahead of her in that department, but she wanted to know if this monster was real, or some fabrication of a mad mon's, or woman's, delusions. So, they had finished up their bussin' in Undella town, mainly checking out the villa that was rumored that Cynthia resided in the summer and springtime, and also checking out the beautiful marine tube, where they could spot Migratin Pokemon from all around the world, and had begun their journey to the north, towards Lacunosa town, where they would hopefully be meeting Iris at the local Pokemon Center. As they traveled in a comfortable silence, Frostlass was floating just a bit behind Naruto, keeping a very close eye on their surroundings. It didn't take long for them to spot a rather creepy-looking entranceway that seemed to have seen much better days. Literally, the trees seemed to be permanently frosted over, and it was in the middle of spring, mind you, and everything in the surrounding area looked dead and lifeless. The trees had very little leaves, and had icicles hanging from the branches. The very grass beyond the point looked a rather disgusting brownish gold color, and even the shrubberies were near lifeless. And the berries that the plants held were shriveled and small. It was even more creepy considering that the area seemed to exude a rather foreboding aura that sent chills up one's spine. Even Frostlass seemed to be very cautious about the surrounding area. Also, it was dead silent. Apart from their footfalls and breathing, there was no other noise. No chirping from the P-doves or other migrating bird Pokémon. Nor were there any rustling nearby from the wild Pokémon. It was like it had been ingrained into them to stay away, or possibly it was their instincts demanding that they keep away if they want to be safe. The only sound of life in the nearby area was from Lacunosa town, which wasn't even half a mile away, and even then, the noises were very faint. Well, this is not creepy at all. Naruto finally spoke out as he finished gazing around the area. Although, oddly enough, it felt like there was a pulling sensation happening within his body, almost asking him to push forward. Indeed, Georgia spoke out, tearing her gaze away from the area that most likely was the location of the giant chasm of the legends. Perhaps something might be of truth within the legend. She added on with a small hum of intrigue, how can there be icicles and snow still be around in this sort of temperature? It must be the work of a very powerful ice-type Pokémon. Nodding his head at George's final statement, he snuck a glance behind him and saw that Frostlass was still keeping her gaze locked onto the pathway, and her body seemed to be much more tense than before. It was almost like she was preparing in case of a sudden ambush of some sort. Let's just make our way into the town. I will feel much more comfortable in a larger group, he said, before gently grabbing hold of Georgia's right arm and started to lead her away from the creepy path. Something tells me that Iris would want to adventure into there, Georgia muttered out, before muttering, idiot girl, under her breath, in which Naruto didn't retort. As he knew that Iris was rather stubborn at times, and once she decided something, it was 98% chance that she would want to complete that little task. Let's just hope that she didn't see it. Or perhaps the permanent frost put her off it, he stated quietly, as he let go of Georgia's hand now that she was following nearby and not focused on the creepy pathway. Looking over his shoulder, he saw that Miyuki was looking rather pleased about something, but he didn't know what it was. Although, for some odd reason she seemed to be taunting Georgia about something. Miyuki, that is enough, he spoke out. Hearing her precious trainer tell her off, she immediately complied, however, not before giving one more stink eye towards Georgia, who he heard SC off under her breath, before she seemed to relax and suddenly floated onto his shoulder, and rested her body against him. Which felt odd, as his body started to tingle as her icy body made contact with his skin. Gently rubbing up the side of Frostlass with his free arm, he heard her coo in delight at the ministration, which he kept up for a few moments before dropping his arm back to his side. He didn't need to see her face, as he knew that she was pouting at the loss of petting she was receiving. She was rather spoilt like that. Making their way into Lacunosa town, they were greeted with rather famous walls that surrounded the entire town, in which, the walls were massive, and were probably about 5 stories tall, which is much, much larger than any building in this rather small, yet quaint town. As they saw a little introductory sign for the town, it read, methodical and orderly for safety, yet proudly displayed just below the wording, was the town's population 16. This is a very small town, despite how good it looks, Naruto pointed out, a little surprised with how low the population of the town was, considering that all the buildings in the area looked to be very well down. And there were even some walkways in which one could maybe get a very nice view of the small town, and from the surrounding area. Maybe the legend has made people frightened to live here, Georgia said with a simple shrug of her shoulders, but she also had to admit, the town was very beautiful. It was just a shame that not that many people were living here. I wouldn't mind living here, she said as an afterthought. A small thought entered her head that gave her a solid blush on her cheeks, and that thought was where the town would gain 2 more residents if they were to settle down here. Naruto opened his mouth. However, before he could speak, he was interrupted when the familiar voice greeted his ears. Hey, Naruto. Unable to hide the smile that was on his face, Naruto turned around. And he was greeted by Iris, who was happily waving her hands at him. Even a little Axu was in her hair, also waving at him, and following slightly behind her, there was an elderly woman, who seemed rather amused at the way Iris was acting. Iris is somewhat short and skinny teenaged girl, something both Naruto and Georgia had teased her about relentlessly. She has a light chocolate skin tone, brown eyes that always seem to sparkle, and knee-length, puffy purple hair kept in a huge, loose ponytail, which also happened to be her little Axu's favorite spot to sit and hide in. She wears a cream-colored top with a pink collar and cuffs, a pink puffy miniskirt with a slit on the left side and a big ribbon over it, white leggings with yellow-colored ends at the legs, and ink and white-yellow strapped shoes with no socks. Despite being a 16-year-old, Iris didn't have that much when it came to her breasts, with them only being a B cup at most, compared to Georgia's C cup breasts. That was also something Georgia loved to hang over her head. However, she did make up for it when it came to her athleticism and endless bouts of energy. "Hey, Iris," Naruto greeted out with a small wave of his own. As Iris ran over to him and squeezed herself into a hug, with Naruto's head resting atop of hers. She relished in the feeling, giving a small sigh as she embraced her childhood friend again for the first time in months. However, she sent a rather mean-looking stink eye towards Georgia. "Hello, Georgia, I see you are doing fine," she said rather tensely once she got out of the hug. "HMPH, I see you are doing well also," Georgia retorted towards the smaller and younger girl. "Caught any more dragon types?" she asked, a hidden challenge in her voice as she did so. "As a matter of fact, I did," Iris said, marching up to Georgia and looking up at her. "Does it even listen to you, or is it like that pesky excadrill of yours?" Georgia retorted with a harsh irk on her face as she reminded Iris of her rather terrible attempt at getting the excadrill to listen to her. "Why you?" Iris muttered out, leaving the threat looming in the air for one to interpret. "It listens to me fine. I bet it could even destroy your beardick." She emphasized her point by poking Georgia just above her right breast, something which she promptly ignored. "Is that a challenge I hear?" Georgia stated, idly bringing the pokeball out of her purse that held the beardick within. "If it is, then I am going to bust another dragon." Before things could escalate even further than before, Naruto promptly got between them, using his hands to separate them. "Girls," he shouted out, before looking at them both with a stern look, "there is to be no fighting between you two. Got it?" "Yes," Iris muttered out, still giving a bitter look towards her rival, before she gave a small harumph and took a few steps back. "How does my breasts feel, Narutilda?" Georgia teased out, a small blush on her face as she felt Naruto's rather calloused hand nearly squeezing her tit. "Huh." Making a noise of confusion, Naruto glanced downwards and saw where his hand was resting. "Gah. Sorry." He quickly apologized, bringing his hand away from her body and keeping it by his side. Iris allowed a weird noise to escape her throat, one that sounded like a growl and a gargle. "Slut." Iris muttered out to herself quietly. "Lass." Frostlass uttered out, appearing directly behind Iris from out of nowhere and placing her arms on her shoulders. The sudden appearance of Frostlass made the poor little Axu take cover in Iris' hair. "Eek!" Iris yelped out, her face rather pale after feeling Frostlass touch her body out of nowhere. "Naruto, please tell Frostlass to stop doing that," she whined out, cowering behind Naruto for extra protection, although she did peek out from around his body. She saw that Frostlass was giggling, with her hands covering the lower part of her face. She also saw out of the corner of her eye that Georgia was trying her best to hide her amusement. "Miyuki, please stop doing that." Naruto spoke out, sending Frostlass a rather stern look. "Apologize to Iris," he stated, placing a hand on his hip as he raised an eyebrow at his Pokémon. Froze. Miyuki seemed a little downtrodden, however, she did float ever so closer to Naruto, before turning her gaze to Iris. "Lass." Dipping her head as she did that as an apology, Miyuki had went to the other side of Naruto when she noticed Iris getting out from behind him. Ahem. Georgia and Iris instantly straightened up as they turned to face the elderly lady that had followed Iris around. "If you lovebirds are finished," she begun, ignoring the two outcries that both Georgia and Iris made, whilst Naruto merely blushed and muttered out a sorry to the elderly woman. "Oh, Naruto, Georgia, this is Maria, the one who told me the legend that this place has." Iris introduced the elderly woman beside Naruto. Pleasure to meet you, ma'am. Naruto greeted out politely, shaking her hand gently. Hello. Georgia merely gave a simple greeting to the elderly lady. The pleasure is all mine. It's been a while since Anion. I was interested in the legend this town has. Maria spoke out, giving a small sigh of reminiscence at older memories of having other people that were interested in the legend many years back. I'll say, it is very interesting. Naruto said. Oh, what was with that path just outside of the town? He said once again, remembering the creepy and foreboding path that they crossed paths with. Well, that's simple, young man. Maria said, her voice holding some amusement. That is the path to the giant chasm, where the monster of legend is said to reside. Naruto idly heard Iris gulp in fear. She too had noticed that pathway. And she had stayed well away from it. Now, knowing that path led to the giant chasm made conflicting thoughts enter her mind. Thought so. Georgia muttered herself, she-ha. An odd inkling that was indeed the case, it seems as though people and Pokemon fear that way. She spoke out to the elderly lady, who gave a hearty chuckle at that. Indeed, I'm afraid that the legend in this town still resides within our hearts, which is why we don't go there to try and fix the place up. She said, waving her hand about to gesture to city, only one person that I know of goes there to check in on things. Quite a interesting young man he is. Maria said, although she was trailing off more towards the end. Oh, really? Naruto questioned, interested to know who that man might have been. Why, of course, Maria said. Before she gazed at the two girls besides Naruto, and seeing their interested expressions, and Naruto's budding curiosity, she simply asked, do you want to visit the place? I do. Naruto spoke out, before turning his gaze to Iris and Georgia. What about you two, are you interested to explore that place? He questioned. Sure, I'm happy to do whatever you want. Georgia said, although she threw in a small wink at the end of that possible innuendo. Nodding his head at that, and clearly ignoring the possible innuendo that Georgia remarked, he turned his attention towards his childhood friend. What about you? There could be ice types lurking about. I'll go. Iris said, mustering up some courage and nodding to her childhood friend. Chuckling lightly, Naruto ruffled Iris' hair. Before he turned around and spoke to Maria, well, I guess we are in. Excellent. Maria said, a small smile on her wrinkled face. Allow me to lead, perhaps I can. Give a small history lesson of the surrounding area of the place as we travel there. She offered the trio as she turned around. That would be lovely, thank you. Naruto spoke out, gently nudging Georgia, who was possibly about to decline the elderly's offer. With that being said, the elderly woman started to walk forward, towards the exit of the town with Naruto, Iris and Georgia following after her. With Frostlass simply floating behind Naruto. Yet, unknown to them, someone had overheard their eagerness to visit the giant chasm. Stepping out into the streets from behind a rather large street pole, maybe. He murmured out. His voice was very gentle and softly spoken, his gentle blue eyes locked onto the retreating form of Naruto. Hearing the flapping of wings, he noticed a large shadow descending to the ground. As the Pokémon landed down on the ground, he looked up to face his companion, perhaps he is the one. He muttered out, gently stroking the glorious white snout of the Pokémon. Getting it to croon in delight as it nudged his hand, do you want to see if this is the trainer that Kirim was waiting for? He asked his companion, who simply nodded its head and lowered itself closer to the ground, allowing the man to climb on his back. It had been a rather creepy journey to say the least. They had traveled up the creepy pathway that just sent shivers down their spine by just gazing at it. And it simply lived up to its looks, and the feeling was even worse when one started to travel deeper into the pathway. For him, it felt like his entire body was slowly being dipped in thin icy cold water with a harsh wind blowing behind him, making the chills even worse. Poor Iris was shivering in her shoes as she clutched onto his arm like it was a lifeline, or perhaps, the only thing that could possibly give her warmth. He didn't blame her for that feeling, as it felt like even when the sun was shining down on them through a thin fog, it just didn't feel like it was actually giving them any warmth. It was the fact that Iris had a vice-like grip that was most certainly going to leave a bruise or two on his skin. From what he noticed on the few occasions that he gazed to Georgia, it seemed like she was less affected by it. Maybe it was she was more used to the cold or ignoring the feeling of chills as she spent most of her time in the village of ice that really prevented her from doing anything. Either that or she was holding everything in, trying to one-up Iris yet again being the tougher girl. He didn't know when, but at some point during the journey, the kind OL. D grandma that was with them had actually disappeared completely, almost like she wasn't there to begin with. Hell, she didn't even make a noise when she was leaving. He was certain that there might have been a twig snapping to actually signal that she was gone, but nope. She just vanished. However, that was neither here nor there, as the thin layer of fog seemed to dissipate as the sun seemed to be exuding the warmth that it was known for, and instead, they were greeted with rather fertile land. Sure, there were a few dangerous-looking icicles and even large patches of frosted ground, but oddly enough, there was plenty of plant life and even flowers in the immediate area. When he said it was massive, it truly was, and it was not an exaggeration. The cave was stories high, too high and steep to climb over. As it looked like it had recently lost a lot of grip thanks to either rainfall or perhaps it was natural degradation of the surface of the rock that it was made from. Here was moss all about the surface of the smooth stone, and there were dead branches lingering about, with some even hanging out from the chips and cracks of the cave, which must have once been a small plant that had managed to. "Don't tell me we are going in there," Iris muttered out, clutching onto Naruto's arm just a little tighter, which did hurt him a bit, but he prevented himself from speaking out about it. If it was comforting for Iris to grab onto his arm like that, then he would gladly take the pain in order to help calm her down, even if it meant being stuck in her vice-like grip that she seemed to get when she was scared. As he looked in the direction that she was pointing, Naruto couldn't help but gulp lightly. There was a massive, jagged entrance, with large pointed stones that were standing tall and proud, which almost gave the cave entrance the appearance of a mouth with sharp teeth, certainly something that could make people turn around and leave. However, he steeled himself. Yes. I'm curious as to what could have possibly created the town's legend, he said, somehow maneuvering his body to escape Iris' grip. I don't see any other way to get over there, Georgia pointed out as she looked about, seeing no possible way to go over the cave rather than through it. Everything was just too steep, and she nor Naruto had any Pokemon with wings that were able to support their weight. Your Dragonite could have helped us, but no, it's too stubborn to even listen, she said, not even realizing that she didn't insult Iris' abilities to raise that Dragonite, for once. Come on, we need to stick together. It will be worse if we separate from Naruto, Georgia said, before she grabbed hold of Iris' arm and then all but dragged her behind as she jogged her way back to Naruto's side. Ouch. Let go. I can walk myself, Iris exclaimed, doing her best to keep up, and keep her balance with Georgia's speed walking. Just another disadvantage of being smaller, she was dragged way too easily for her liking. And it was really uncomfortable. Ladies, Naruto forcefully whispered out, giving them a stern look over his shoulder as he made a shushing motion with his index finger over his puckered lips. We need to be silent, no need to take any risks, he said, before unclipping a poke ball from his belt. Without speaking a word, the poke ball burst open, and out came Frostlass, who gave a little twirl and a small cry of her name, before she looked questioningly up at her trainer, Froze. Miyuki, I want you to be vigilant as we make our way through this cave. We don't know what could lie ahead, Naruto said to his Pokemon. Could you please do that? He asked her, petting her head lightly. Lass, she called out, nodding her head, before her entire posture seemed to change, becoming more alert rather than playful. Thank you, he simply said, before he looked over his shoulder once again and gazed at Iris and Georgia. Are you sure that you want to follow me in? You don't have to if you don't want to, he stated, looking at them both carefully. Georgia nodded her head sharply. I want to. One could never be too safe when it concerns creepy caves in the middle of nowhere, she said as she stepped towards Naruto. What she didn't say was that she was unwilling to let her crush go in alone and be in danger without them even knowing it. Naruto nodded his head at that, before he turned his gaze to Iris, his first friend that he made in the village of dragons, and the person who was hit the hardest when his punishment was administered to him. I'll go as well, Iris said after a few moments of silence, nodding her head to reassure herself. Naruto couldn't help but smile at that. Now, He wasn't calling Iris a chicken or anything, but he was pretty surprised to know that she was actually going to be following them in. Iris and Georgia followed after him, but not before Georgia spoke out softly, "Color me impressed. I would have thought that you would stay behind." It might have sounded a little snarky, but there was a hint of respect in her voice as she spoke that statement. Iris huffed a little at that, sending a look at her rival in both love and battle. "If it were just with you, then yes, I would have stayed behind, but I'm not leaving Naruto behind. I already lost him once, and I don't want to lose him again because I didn't do anything." Without even trying, Iris had managed to garner a little more respect from the Dragon Buster. "That was Georgia. You do have a spine, it just needs to have Naruto involved. How far can I push that?" She questioned herself after shaking her head before continuing to press onwards into the cave after Naruto. She couldn't help but feel a little interested to see how far Iris could get pushed when it came to Naruto. Would it cause her to become stronger once she left a challenge concerning him? Or perhaps if she offered a little wager for Naruto's first time on the line, how much would Iris push herself for that? A few moments after the trio went into the giant chasm, a massive shadow fell upon the land, and moments later, 2 feet thudded onto the ground from a great height, and the person was revealed to be the man that listened in on the conversation that happened between the elder and the trio that just went into the cave. It was revealed that the man was very tall, standing at a height of 5 feet 11. Which made him stick out from a crowd, and made him tower over many others. However, that was not all. Not only was he very tall, but he was also a slender young man, who was probably in his early 20s at best. He is fair-skinned with green eyes that seemed to exude friendliness and comfort, and he had long chartreuse green hair tied into a low fluffy ponytail and shorter pieces framing his face. He wears a white, mid-sleeved shirt with a black shirt under it, a pair of cider green slip-on shoes and beige skinny-fit pants, with a cube attached to his chain near his left hip. He also wears a black and white bracelet on his right wrist and a yellow rectangular tri-bracelet and a blue and black pendant on a chain around his neck. His most notable feature is his hat, which is white and black with a black peak. This was Natural Harmonia Gropius, otherwise known as In, for short, and that was also his preferred name. He was the trainer of truths, and the known trainer of Reshiram, who he sees more as a close companion and friend rather than a Pokemon, and he was also the once known rival to the trainer of ideals. Yet, now, here he was, in front of the giant chasm, hoping that this trainer that he was following would be the chosen trainer of Kyurem. He knew of the legend that Kyurem was once a singular, great dragon Pokemon that split up to the conflicting ideals and truths of the brothers. Centuries ago, thus Reshiram and Zekrom were born, with Kyurem being the near-lifeless husk that remained. From the very little information that appeared for this, Naruto, trainer, hope had blossomed in the heart for N, as Naruto was not an idealist, nor was he the stickler for the truth. In his mind, Kyurem was the one that unified truths and ideals into one, or in other cases, he was the Wuji of the trio, the absence of yin and yang, which were personified as Reshiram and Zekrom respectively. Reshiram, we need to catch up with those girls. Naruto is to face this challenge alone. He spoke out softly, his voice was neither too masculine, nor was it too feminine. Reshiram merely nodded its head, before following N into the cave, its body tingling as it did so. As Naruto, Georgia and Iris traveled further into the cave, the colder it got. Which was unfortunate due to the constant chattering of the teeth, which was starting to get really annoying, but at the same time, it was also a pain for Iris, considering that she was not fond of colder temperatures. Another thing was that the very rock formations that were jutting up from the floor were basically frozen solid. Or that there were massive, and sharp icicles looming dangerously overhead. If one were to fall, that could create a domino effect and cause the other ones to fall, creating a very dangerous and possible fatal shower of ice. Yet, as they continued moving forward into the cave, a weird feeling started to overcome him. Does anyone feel something? He questioned suddenly, simply wondering if he was starting to feel things that weren't there. I feel like I am being watched. Georgia spoke out, shivering lightly as she cupped both of her hands and blew into them, trying to warm them up with her breath alone. It feels like I'm freezing to death in here. Iris spoke out, shivering rather violently as the axu that she had was most definitely burying itself in her hair, Ying to make a nest out of it to sleep in to warm up, however. I do feel like something is lurking around, and it's not Miyuki. She added on, making it clear that it wasn't Frostlass causing this sensation. Naruto hummed out, glad to know that it wasn't only him feeling this odd sensation, apart from the odd pulling sensation that was leading him deeper into the cave. However, he shot a glance towards his Frostlass, who was lurking about. He saw that she too was looking a little concerned about something, and looking about wildly at times as well. Just keep an eye out. We don't know what might be lurking in here, Naruto stated, looking at both of his companions and his Pokemon as he said that. Soon enough, Naruto and his companions reached a rather ominous-looking cave opening that led to a deeper part of the cavern, and there were also icicles looming above it, all threatening to drop at a moment's notice. Well, I guess we go through this, Naruto said, feeling a bit nervous all of a sudden. And he made that known to everyone. I feel like something is in there, something dangerous, he muttered out. He swore that he could hear something moving deeper in the cavern. But he didn't want to point it out in case the others didn't hear it. No, Naruto said, gazing back towards his childhood friends, I would rather myself heading in there alone. So if something is dangerous, you all can escape to safety, he admitted softly, bringing his gaze back towards the ominous-looking cavern entrance. What? That's just stupid, Georgia yelled out. She was so tempted to smack Naruto over the head for even thinking that. No, it's not, Naruto replied back in turn. If something does happen, I would rather have you two safe, rather than in danger with me. I promise you that I will be safe. Georgia was about to retort once again, however, she was stopped when she felt a sudden tug on her sleeve. Looking down towards Iris, who was the one tugging on her sleeve, she couldn't help but exclaim. What? However, she was a little surprised by the stern, yet resigned expression on her face, an oddity for the normally hyper and excitable girl. It's no use, Iris said, shifting her gaze to the back of Naruto. Once he decides on something like this, he doesn't let go on it. She added on, turning her attention back towards Georgia. He has done it before for me, back in the village of dragons, and he doesn't break his promises either. There was a moment of silence that followed for Georgia. Her mind and emotions were conflicted, however, eventually. Her rationality finally won over and she gave a soft sigh. Fine. But we will stay here, and help him should he need it, she said, before tugging her arm away from Iris. Yes, we should, Iris spoke out, taking a few steps away from Georgia. All right, Naruto. We trust you, Iris spoke out to her childhood friend and not-so-secret crush. Just please, come back to us safely, she said, before she was unable to hold back her tears and she rushed towards him, bringing him into a bone-crushing hug. Ouch, he muttered out, feeling a small sting as Iris seemed to gain strength from out of nowhere with the hug. However, he couldn't help but have a small smile on his face as the words of Iris sunk into his mind. Don't worry, I will come back safely. I will be back for the both of you, he said, gently rubbing Iris' arm that was in front of him. Naruto left Iris like that for a few moments, to allow the poor girl to have her comforting hug before he ventured off deeper into the cavern. Iris finally let go of Naruto, stepping back a few steps and rubbing away a stray tear that was falling down her face. Good luck, she whispered out, her voice being carried by the echo of the cave. Thanks, you two behave yourselves, Naruto said, sending a small, stern look at the duo that were known to cause some ruckus if left alone together. As he let that sink in for a few moments, he then turned to Frostlass. Ready? He asked. Lass. Miyuki nodded her head, a determined expression set on her features as she floated down closer to Naruto's body, making sure that she was within touching distance at all times. Not only for her own comfort, but for her to better protect him from a surprise attack that might come their way. With Frostlass displaying her readiness, he took a deep, Ming breath before he entered through the cave opening and deeper into the cavern. As Iris and Georgia were both nearby, watching Naruto until he disappeared into the darkness of the new area, they were shocked to hear another voice. Reshiram, imprison. All of a sudden, Iris and Georgia found themselves trapped in a large, sealed dome that was transparent enough so that they could see through it, so they both turned around. Angered expressions on them as they reached towards their pokeballs to fight whoever did this. However, they were stopped as surprised, yet awed expressions made their way onto their features. No way. Georgia muttered out, unbelieving to what she was witnessing. Reshiram, the Pokemon of legend, Iris said, much more disbelief in her voice as she gazed at 1-0. The Pokemon that the village of dragons worshipped along with its counterpart, and those that followed in the path of truths, to try and befriend. Reshiram is a white-colored, bipedal Pokemon with draconic, avian and mammalian traits. A long, voluminous wispy mane streams out from the upper side of the snout and outwards from its head. The top of this mane is adorned with two protrusions, which resemble ears. Reshiram's face is fringed with spiky features, and it has a small, pointed extension below the chin. Its eyes have blue irises and black pupils. There are two pairs of pointed teeth visible when its mouth is open. One in the upper jaw and one in the lower. Reshiram has a long and slender neck, with a fluffy, collar-like protrusion jutting out of two gray, glass-like neck bands. Its arms begin slender and arm-like, but then flare out into a more wing-like appearance, sporting four claws which resemble hands on the leading edge. There are plates at the back of Reshiram's hands that sport a similar color to its neck rings. Reshiram has a feathered or furry feature on its chest, with the lower portion protruding outwards to a point. Long feather-like protrusions jut out of its thighs. On its feet are large gray claws, 3 at the front and 1 positioned at the back, resembling high heels. Reshiram's tail is a mass of plume and ribbon-like extensions, surrounded by 2 large bands, similar to the ones around its neck. It was a massive Pokemon, standing at a massive height of 10 feet 06. It towered over everybody, and most other Pokemon, yet it was also very graceful-looking, almost feminine in nature. Compared to Zekrom's demeanor in statues and carvings, and it was also floating a few inches off the ground. "Sorry, girls," N said, jumping down from Reshiram's back, revealing himself to the 2 girls within the makeshift, translucent prison. "Let us out. Why did you do this?" Georgia said, getting over her shock much more quicker than Iris did, and she was letting her temper fly. "I'm sorry. But it was a necessity. Naruto must face the challenge alone," N said, raising his hands up to placate the 2 girls, and showing that he meant no harm to them. "Challenge? What challenge?" Iris spoke out, finally breaking out of her trance at seeing the beautiful dragon-type Pokemon. N gazed down towards the entrance in which Naruto entered through moments ago. He is facing off against Kyurem, the 3rd Pokemon of the Tao trio, he said, bringing his gaze back towards them. "Kyurem? I've never heard of that Pokemon," Iris muttered out, bringing a hand to her chin in order to try and remember anything at all about a Pokemon named Kyurem. "Not many have," N simply said. However, if one were to believe in myths and legends, Reshiram and Zekrom were once one Pokemon, the ultimate dragon. But they split up to better suit the brothers' ideals and truths long ago, and once the split happened, Kyurem was born, all but an empty husk of what he once was. He added on, "He has been waiting for someone worthy to test, and it seems that Naruto might be that person, the one who represents Kyurem's side of things." "What do you mean, Kyurem's side of things?" Georgia retorted back. She might not be huge on myths or legends, but she couldn't help but admit that this interested her. Like Reshiram and Zekrom, who represent truths and ideals, respectively. Kyurem is said to represent the middle of the trio, limitless one could say from the beliefs of Wuji. N said, before taking a small pause to allow everything to sink in for the girls. He is Nate. Her too focused on the truth, nor does he chase ideals. He is the balance to the yin and yang, so one doesn't overpower the other, he binds them together, so to speak. He added on, trying to make things much more simpler if they didn't understand the first part. "Wow," Iris muttered out, fully enraptured by N's explanation of Kyurem. So really, everyone has been praising Reshiram and Zekrom. But Kyurem had been forgotten by nearly everyone, barring a select few. N turned to face her. "You could say that. It's just that Kyurem hasn't shown himself to the world, nor is he more prominent. The trio, because people either focus too much on the truths or ideals," he said, before turning to Reshiram and noticed how he was shaking. "It's all right. There is nothing to worry about," he said, petting the vast white Pokemon and making it croon in delight. "So, is there anything else you want to know?" To pass time, and hopefully, not come off as a bad person for what I did, to make sure that Naruto faces this challenge alone. En offered with a small eye smile. After a few moments of traveling through the ominous cave opening, he suddenly found himself in a very chilly room. He LDC his breath every time he took an exhale. There was basically a layer or two of permanent fog that made the room that much creepier, and there were small patches of ice on the ground that made it very slippery. Although, oddly enough, there were no stalagmites jutting up from the ground, but there were a few stalactites looming down from the roof, which was more than 30 feet from the ground. Who dares? The deep, rumbling, foreboding voice that echoed throughout the rather barren cavern room sent chills up Naruto's spine as he gazed around to try and locate it. Frostlass was much the same, but her attention was set directly in front of her. Naruto suddenly felt like he was being watched yet again, so he turned his head so quickly in that direction that it was surprising that he didn't suffer from whiplash. He found two gleaming yellow eyes through the thick layer of fog. Then he heard the almighty rumbles of feet stomping against the ground, and before long, a great, big shish Ado was starting to form just behind those gleaming yellow eyes. It didn't take long for whatever was lingering behind the thick layer of fog to make itself known, as the entire body of the Pokemon came before Naruto. He couldn't help but take a step back in fear for what he saw, not for the scariness of the Pokemon but for how fierce it looked. The Pokemon was mainly gray and blue, it was also bipedal of indefinable but seemingly draconic basis. It has a blue head and snout, but has gleaming yellow eyes without pupils. It has a pair of pointed, light bluish horns on its head and a yellow crest on its skull. 3 pointed teeth jut out the bottom of either side of its jaws, which seem to be frozen shut by the ice covering its head. Its long, gray neck has lines running around its whole body, legs, arms and tail. It has 2 arms, each with its own claw, and each arm is jointed together from its oddly shaped blue wings, which could possibly be used for flying and storing cold air, if the frost permeating through the air was anything to go by. Each wing has 2 nasty-looking spikes of ice adorning it. The ice covering the wings can break, revealing gray tendril-like appendages on its back. The right side of its body seems to be damaged in some way, as the wing and horn on its head are shorter than the left side. The right side of its head also has a spiked edge near its jaw hinge that is absent from its left. Its legs are somewhat slender, and has 3 sharp ice-like claws on each enormous foot. Its tail has 3 blue conical spikes on its tip, and appears to be some RT of propulsion device or a container of energy. Exactly what it is based on is unclear, but it may be a damaged turbine that has been spotted on many different statues of Reshiram and Zekrom throughout the region. What the? Naruto muttered out, never having seen a Pokemon like this before in his life. To him, it looked almost man-made, but he could tell that it wasn't, as small puffs of icy cold breath was seen at regular intervals near its jaw. Naruto stole a glance towards Miyuki, who seemed to be shivering in fear at whatever this creature was before it. Miyuki. Naruto called out, garnering the attention of his Frostlass, stay close. I'll protect you, he said, before gently grabbing her and pulling the Frostlass behind his body, effectively turning himself into a and shield so that the Frostlass had the first opportunity to escape. Do you think you are worthy of battling me? Worthy? Naruto questioned lightly, unwilling to look away from the Pokemon that was slowly inching closer. He had heard of Pokemon using telepathy to speak, but he had yet to run into one, and now that he knew this fact, it must be powerful. It didn't look like a psychic-type Pokemon. Well, do you? It spoke out once again, its eyes gleaming even brighter than before as its deep, rumbling voice echoed through the barren cavern room once again. Yes, I am worthy. Naruto said, NSWERING the question that it asked before. Hey, very well then. Suddenly, 2 massive columns of glittering ice that looked to be extremely jagged rose up from the very ground just a few feet in front of Naruto and touched the ceiling. Slowly forming an archway at the very tip of the columns of ice, nearly making him lose balance from the sudden appearance of them, passed through the gates. The Pokemon all but commanded him. Naruto shot a glance towards Miyuki behind him, and he nodded his head after seeing a determined expression make way onto her features. As he took his steps towards the massive columns of ice, he couldn't help but marvel at the beauty of them. They seemed to shine with an unnatural bluish-green glow, even when there was very little light being reflected around. Tacky. In a few steps past the massive columns of ice, Naruto stopped for a moment, leaving his gaze on the Pokémon as his other hand went towards the poke balls clipped on his person. He swore that he could feel them rumble in eagerness to battle. The back of the Pokémon seemed to release frosted air, which in turn was blown towards Naruto, covering him in a little layer of cold frosting, something which he didn't enjoy. However, as he rubbed himself down, he heard the Pokémon in front of him give a roar of exertion, then he felt the very ground shake once again. Boom, boom, boom. Like before, more moss. Sieve columns of sharpened ice rose from the ground, only this time they were less grandiose in appearance, rather they looked to be more ragged and intimidating. However, the appearance of them soon came clear to Naruto. They were forming a cage. As he looked all around this makeshift battlefield, there were large columns of ice that decorated it, making those imposing pillars the limits of movement that a Pokémon could take within the battle. He was sure that if his Pokémon were to leave the cage, then the Pokémon in front of them wouldn't be too pleased about it. "May I know the name of my challenger?" it asked, snapping Naruto out of his little trance that he got in thanks to the ice pillar cage. "My name is Naruto." Naruto replied back, before taking a Pokeball and expanding it, readying it for the upcoming battle. Something told him that this would be extremely challenging. My name is Kyurem." It decided to humor his challenger, giving his name so he could remember it. Naruto merely nodded his head at that, before giving a shout of, "Cryogonal, go!" As the Pokémon was released from its Pokeball, it was revealed to Kyurem what Naruto's first Pokémon was. Cryogonal resembles a shiny, blue hexagonal snowflake. Its facial expression is frozen, which leaves Cryogonal with a still, aggressive-looking face. 2 cracks run through its face, the upper opening contains its eyes and the lower serves as a mouth. It has 2 glowing eyes and its large mouth contains an extendable chain of ice, which is used for hunting. Cryogonal made weird humming noises as it floated in the air. Its gaze locked onto its opponent. "Your move." The Pokémon spoke out, allowing him the first move in the battle. "Cryogonal, start things off with light screen." Naruto commanded, wanting to have the best possible defense up and running as soon as possible. Almost instantly, Cryogonal hummed before a massive hexagonal wall appeared in front of it that was glittering with a soft blue hue, and despite it disappearing, it was still active, and any hexagons that were hit by an attack to most of the force from it, lessening the damage received in the long run. With its opponent's move done and dusted, Kyurem's right wing ice spike suddenly gained a sinister tint to it, then the entire spike was engulfed in that energy, and a massive claw made out of shadows came out of it. In a surprising burst of speed from Kyurem, it suddenly appeared in front of Cryogonal, its wing poised to take a massive attack to the Pokémon. "Now use Reflect," Naruto called out in a panic, wanting to complete the wall, so to speak, when it comes to taking many more hits. Cryogonal then launched white orbs from its mouth that then rotated around its body, glowing a whitish blue as it did so, then a multi-colored see-through glass wall outlined its body, making it a barricade that physical attacks must pass through to do damage. This was Naruto's battle strategy. Cryogonal was by far his most bulkiest Pokémon, and who could also hit like a truck when given the chance to, so he utilized its utility with its attacking power, to not only help itself lasting longer in battle, but if the need ever arose, Naruto could just switch Pokémon so they could have the benefits of the screens on their side. The Reflect went up just in time. The barrier that had formed had managed to take hold of Kyurem's Shadow Claw attack and slow it down. It didn't stop the attack entirely, as the wing still made a solid connection to Cryogonal's hexagonal body as it cried out in pain and rocketed backwards, a small SC Ratch mark adorning the point of contact. "Nice one, Cryogonal," Naruto called out, praising his Pokémon for taking an attack like that from a powerhouse and still stand, floating strong. Cryogonal made another weird humming sound, although it was more pain-induced after taking that massive hit. "Now, I want you to use Icy Wind." Cryogonal stopped moving around in the air, and its body gained a soft whitish-blue glow. Its eyes seemed to shine in the darkness as it started to produce extremely cold winds from its mouth that sped towards Kyurem, as the wind traveled further and the temperature dropped even more. Small icicles started to appear in the wind that collided with Kyurem, who for its part, didn't even flinch as the icicles settled upon its body momentarily. The Kyurem then started retaliating when a small beam of grayish-silver light started to form near its jaw. "Dodge that flash cannon," Naruto called out, knowing what that move was thanks to the grayish-silver hue that it was. As soon as Kyurem released that flash cannon, it zipped towards the floating cryogonal, but using its surprising amount of speed that the crystallizing Pokémon had, it was able to avoid the attack by merely floating downwards, allowing one of the hexagonal barriers to fade away once it got hit by that attack. Now, if cryogonal were to get hit by an attack, it wouldn't be powered down due to the hole in the barrier. But that was nothing to worry about yet. "Now, use ancient power," Naruto called out. Cryogonal gave another small cry as it heard the command, before its body was encased in a whitish glow before a see-through afterimage of itself. Before that afterimage spun so quickly that it picked up small, loose pebbles and they were flung all around the area, with one or two lucky ones striking the Kyurem. As the afterimage continued to spin, it eventually condensed into a bright silver ball of energy that was hurtled towards the Kyurem. Enough of this. That was all that was said before the Kyurem seemingly disappeared from its spot, effectively making the ancient power useless as it struck nothing but the cold, hard ground, and reappeared behind the cryogonal. Naruto couldn't even utter out another command as Kyurem's eyes turned from a very eerie and gleaming yellow, to an enraged, blood red in color, and a fierce red miasma appeared around Kyurem, before it street arted to use tail and sharpened wings to deliver an absolute beatdown onto the cryogonal. Even with the reflect up, it was simply no match for the outrage that Kyurem was unleashing. He gritted his teeth, before pulling out cryogonal's poke ball, unable to continue to watch the massacre that was happening, return. He called out, as the red beam from the poke ball engulfed the cryogonal and it was safely returned to the safety of the poke ball. "Smart choice," Kyurem offhandedly mentioned, as the red miasma dissipated away from its body, and its blood-red eyes returned to their natural eerie gleaming yellow. Miyuki murmured out, turning her attention onto Naruto, her eyes almost pleading for her to get sent in. "No, I'm not sending you in. I would rather not use you," he said. No. Because that he didn't think she could battle him eye for eye so to speak, but because he didn't want her getting hurt. "Abomasnow, let's go," Naruto called out, releasing his second Pokémon into the battle, along with an afterthought that he was regretting sticking with an ice-type themed Pokémon team. Now that he knew that this Pokémon was either a dragon, steel or ice type, or perhaps a combination of two of the types. However, something was making him lean towards it being a dual dragon and ice type. As the Abomasnow was revealed and landed on the ground with a solid thud, kicking up a small cloud of dirt as it did so. It gave a battle cry of its own, "Snow." Abomasnow is a large, bipedal creature covered in shaggy, white fur. It has pale purple eyes with bushy eyebrows and long strands of fur covering its mouth. Two tufts of longer fur grow on both its back and chest, with the chest fur being longer on the female, which was Naruto's Abomasnow was. Its hands, feet, and tail are dark green and spiky, similar to the foliage of an evergreen tree. On its back are 4 green spikes that resemble pine cones. It took only a moment, but as soon as the Abomasnow was sent out, a large gust of extremely cold air was released from her body, which then continued upwards into the air, and it got so cold that it was starting to produce hail as it came crashing down to the ground below, making it an extreme hazard that damaged everything barring ice types. "Start things with grass not," Naruto called out, wanting to take advantage of the weight difference between the two Pokémon. Abomasnow gave a sharp cry. Before its eyes glowed a soft green, then 4 large blades of grass managed to grow on the ground just before Kyurem's feet, before they shot up into the air, wrapping around Kyurem's feet and tying themselves into a knot, the grip so powerful that it tripped the Pokémon up, making his posture off balance, before gravity did the rest and he toppled over like a sack of bricks. "Keep it up, use wood hammer," he commanded out, his confidence building as the Pokémon was down on the ground, still entangled within the vice-like grip that was the grass knot. Without warning, Abomasnow rushed towards the downed Pokémon, the dark green part of Abomasnow's arm glowing turquoise, which then took the shape of a stump. As it came upon Kyurem's downed body, he seemed to give a grunt of surprise. Before Abomasnow slammed the stump of energy onto Kyurem's body with as much force as it could muster. To say that there was a solid boom, along with a solid crunching noise was an understatement. The blow was so strong that the stump of energy shattered and splintered, not only covering Kirim in those pesky things, but the force of the impact also forced the energy splinters back up into Abomasnow's face. And dark green sparks flew off of her body, making her shudder in pain. That was why it was such a risky move. It was powerful, sure, but it also caused massive recoil damage to the user. Yet, that was not all that worried Naruto. It was the fact that the hexagonal barriers finally revealed themselves once more. However, they were not to stay, as they all shattered, making small glittering trails that fell harmlessly to the ground. Oh no. He muttered to himself. He needed to be much more careful now, as the light screen that was set up by Cryogonal earlier had worn off. Meaning that Kirim's non-contact moves were now back at full power if they hit. Lucky blow. Kirim once again uttered out, before his entire body flexed and the knots that were around his feet snapped, freeing his body once more. Abomasnow, get out of there. Naruto called out. However, once again, he was marginally too late, as in a blink of an eye, Kirim had managed to rotate his body, before his jagged tail slammed directly into the gut of Abomasnow, forcing it back many feet. The force was so great that Abomasnow's feet left small trenches in the ground. Ha! Once again, another grayish-silver beam was fired. This time, the target was Abomasnow. Quick dodge it. Abomasnow managed to spot the incoming attack, and using as much power as it could muster, it managed to leap out of the way. However, it was simply not enough, as the powerful beam of grayish-silver light came into contact with her right foot, making her cry her name out in agony as the super-effective move hit its target. No. Naruto cried out, gritting his teeth as he turned his attention away from Abomasnow and towards Kirim, watching what he would do next. It didn't take long before Kirim begun his next assault, once again, his eyes turning from the gleaming yellow to blood red, and the same foreboding miasma covered his entire body as he raced towards Abomasnow. The intent was clear. He was going to absolute destroy his enemy. Abomasnow, meet it head-on with mega punches. Naruto commanded. He knew that Abomasnow was not going to be able to dodge the attack, or if she did, he knew Hat Kirim would continue to chase after her. He would be relentless until he found his target. So, in a risky move, Naruto decided to meet the outrage head-on with his own attack. Hopefully, that would be able to get enough damage and to weaken Kirim even further. Abo. Snow. With both of its arms glowing a pure white color that threatened to blind anyone close by, the Abomasnow stood her ground, planting her feet in the ground as small roots came out of her feet and dug into the ground, using the move Ingrain on reflex, as it waited for the most opportune time to strike. Snow. Boom. Nah. Naruto covered his face to prevent any stray dirt and dust particles to enter his eyes. He had heard the roar of agony from both Kirim and from his Abomasnow, and he really hoped that Abomasnow came out on top. However, something was telling him that was not the case. Peeking out from under one of his arms, he saw that the massive dust cloud was settling, and he could see the shadows of the Pokémon once again. He saw that a Mega Punch did indeed connect with Kirim's body. However, it was simply not enough. The punching power was not enough for it to halt the momentum, and Kirim's tail slammed into Abomasnow's side, getting her to cry out in pain as she lost her balance and was launched backwards with frightening speed towards one of the many ice pillars that were erected by Kirim itself before the start of the battle. Slam. Crunch. Naruto himself couldn't help but wince in pain as he saw his Pokémon have a massive collision with the hardened pillar of ice, getting launched into it with so much force that the ice cracked and splintered, with an extremely rough indentation of Abomasnow's body shape as she slumped to the ground, her eyes replaced by small swirls. Naruto clicked his tongue in annoyance. Not at the fact that his Abomasnow went down, but for the fact that he was basically placing his Pokémon in pain and danger, all for some stupid test that this Pokémon was doing. With a small sigh, Naruto fished out Abomasnow's Pokeball once again, set on returning her to prevent any further injuries should the Kirim attack once again. No. Naruto spoke out, aft. Returning his Abomasnow to its Pokeball, before turning his attention towards Frostlass, who was looking very antsy, and looked like she wanted to avenge her fellow Ice-type Pokémon, and her fellow female. I don't want you to go out. I promise that I will use you in the next battle. Naruto said, trying to allow his pledge to sink into his Frostlass. Froze. Sighing once again at the fact that Frostlass didn't seem to be convinced that would happen, he decided to place another offer on the table, one which he knew that she couldn't refuse, especially within the recent months, as she seemed to love them even more. "I'll let you sleep in my sleeping bag, using me as a pillow," he said, garnering Frostlass' attention once again. "I'll even pamper you with double the massages that you normally get at night time." Froze. Lass. Frostlass cheered loudly, her hands in the air with an extremely pleased expression on her face. One was to easily imagine the happiness that she was feeling, along with the thoughts that were running through her head with the fact that she was now able to sleep with Naruto rather than in the poke ball, along with the pampering that she would receive. She just loved Naruto's massages. They felt truly magical, and despite her being an ice type, he had the only warmth that she ever loved, and had a craving for. Unable to hold her happiness in by herself, she CMPLY floated over to Naruto and glomped the life out of him, her icy wind attack leaking out of her mouth due to her unable to control herself. Yet, even with the cold shivers running down his spine, Naruto couldn't help but crack a smile as he returned the affection that his Frostlass was displaying to him. She was always the more affectionate one out of the rest of his Pokémon. Unclipping the final poke ball that was on his belt, Naruto held it out for Frostlass. "I want you to return, make sure that you are completely safe," he asked her gently, knowing the fact that Frostlass didn't enjoy being inside the poke ball. And she could easily escape it if she wanted to, but this was the best option for him. "Lass," she ever so reluctantly agreed, giving Naruto a rather sad Lillipup eyes. Before she taped the poke ball and was sucked into its confines. "Thank you," he murmured out, before placing it back onto his belt. Looking down at the final poke ball that he held in his hand, he placed it against his forehead. "Good luck," he muttered out, somehow knowing that the Pokémon within had heard him. Wiggle. Cracking a slight smile at the fact his poke ball had wiggled softly within his grip, conveying that the Pokémon held within had heard him and had somehow reciprocated the murmur, he took a calming breath, before throwing his poke ball into the air, releasing his final Pokémon, and if it went down, then he would leave the battle, as he was unwilling to injure his Frostlass against a Pokémon like this. He didn't like seeing his Pokémon in pain in general, but knowing the fact that he would be putting Frostlass in harm's way didn't sit right with him at all. She had been his closest companion over the years, and his very first Pokémon, and he never wanted to put her into danger. "Go, Beardick," Naruto called out, watching as the poke ball exploded, and his final Pokémon for this fight was released into the makeshift battle arena. Beardick is a very large ursine, quadrupedal pole. Bear-like Pokémon capable of standing on its hind legs, at which, its average height is 8 feet 6, making it a very intimidating Pokémon to come up against. It has bluish-white fur with a particularly fuzzy and plump underbelly and a shaggy tuft for a tail. 3 spikes of ice hang from its lower jaw, forming a beard. Its face consists of a long snout, beady black eyes, and rounded ears. Its large forepaws have black claws and paw pads. This needs to end quickly, Naruto thought to himself, watching as his Beardick took an active stance, recognizing that the opponent was indeed very strong and worthy of his time and effort to battle him. "Alright, Beardick, start off with Icicle Crash," Naruto commanded his Pokémon, unleashing one of the more powerful moves that Beardick knew right off the bat. To continue to pressure the lightly damaged Kyurem. As soon as the Beardick processed the command given, it took in a mighty deep breath, before it exhaled and released a powerful, freezing wind from its mouth that slowly formed into small clumps of blue sparkles. However, as the sparkles continued to travel within the wind, the low temperature, they grew larger and larger, before taking shape into large, sharp icicles that soon gained velocity and continued to pepper and torment the Kyurem. Judging by the grunts of pain and annoyance that was being released by the Kyurem, Naruto could guess that the move was indeed taking a toll on it, but he still didn't let up, follow up with Slash. He called out, wanting to have another powerful blow whilst the Pokémon was still distracted by the constant peppering of sharp icicles upon its body. Beardick gave a roar of approval as it heard his new command. Going down on all fours, the Beardick charged towards the opponent with a display of fright. ending pace for a Pokémon as large as it was, and as it got closer, its right paw started to glow a bright white, and large claws of energy. Kyurem was only just able to take his attention off of the pelting icicles crashing against his body when he had heard another cry and the thumping footfalls of his approaching opponent. However, he wasn't fast enough to dodge out of the way of the incoming attack, as the Beardic was already slashing downwards. Slash! Gah! With a gargled cry as the slash attack landed, Kyurem seemed to glare at the Beardic that was just within its strike range. Yet, the Beardic didn't flinch aware at the cold glare that it was receiving. Instead, it seemed to flourish in it. Once again, Kyurem gave a small grunt as another grayish-silver beam was starting to form in front of its jaw. Meaning that if it were to charge, it would be very painful were it to hit because of the short distance between the two Pokémon. Beardic, superpower! Naruto yelled out, not wanting the Kyurem to charge up its attack. Giving a sharp roar of acceptance as the Beardic heard the command, it was then shrouded in a very faint blue aura as the muscles in its body flexed, making its bow die look nearly twice as big as it already was. Before Kyurem could even fire off the flash cannon, the Beardic was already upon it, slamming itself against its body, hard enough that it was actually launched in the air, a solid few feet off the ground. In another flash, the Beardic had postured itself so both of its flexed arms were brought together, before it used its spinning momentum to connect another solid strike to the Kyurem's underside. Gah! Naruto watched as the Kyurem was sent flying away from that ferocious underside strike from his Beardic's superpower, and he also watched as the eyes of the Pokémon seemingly widened before it slammed back into the ground, kicking up a massive icy dust cloud that blew across the whole makeshift battleground. Stay on guard, Naruto called out, warning his Beardic about the possible impending danger that could follow. He learned from experience that one should never let their guard down when it came to dust clouds and opponents behind said dust clouds. He had lost a small handful of battles when he first started out because of that mistake. His Beardic flexed its body in response, and braced itself in case of an oncoming attack. No need. As Kyurem's voice rattled through the area, and echoed off the walls, Naruto was a little confused, and he voiced that easily, huh. Soon enough, the dust cloud dissipated, and Kyurem was looking worse for wear. Having scratch marks littering his body as he shakily stood back upon his feet, gazing towards the Beardic and Naruto, a hint of respect shining in its eyes. You have proven your worth, trainer. I yield. He admitted to them, although it sounded rather hard for Kyurem to admit that little piece of information. Still a little taken back by the Kyurem, Naruto waited for a few moments, waiting for the ruse to be over and for Kyurem to counterattack, but it never happened. So, Naruto returned the Beardic back to its Pokeball, whispering a small, thanks, to the Pokémon. Thank you, for the battle, Naruto said rather awkwardly, not knowing what to say to the Pokémon. He had never been in this situation before, especially when it came to a Pokémon powerful enough to talk. No, thank you. Kyurem's deep, rumbling voice spoke out again, before he took a few, staggering, lumbering footsteps in his direction. You have shown me that there is something for everyone. Ah, you're welcome. Naruto spoke out, rather confused at where this was going. I have a request, catch me. Kyurem said, ever so bluntly. What? Naruto stuttered out, blinking in confusion, almost like he had misheard the Pokémon before him. Catch me. For too long have I waited for someone that was worthy, and this battle proved to me that you are worthy for me. Kyurem spoke out, taking a few more steps towards Naruto. You showed compassion, love towards your Pokémon, yet you still didn't back down from the challenge once you entered the arena, even though you knew that this battle would be challenging. Oh, wow, was what Naruto could actually say at this point. I would be honored, Naruto said, flashing a small smile towards Kyurem, after a few moments of silence. Patting himself down, Naruto made a small noise of relief when he had felt a spare Pokeball in his pocket of his pants, quickly pulling that out and showing it to the Kyurem. Are you sure about this? He questioned the Pokémon. He looked up from the Pokeball in his hands and looked him right in the eye. I'm sure. That was all that was said before the Kyurem used one of his wings to touch the little button, the Pokeball. Before he was engulfed by a red beam of light and was sucked into the Pokeball, which shook once before dinging, signifying the Pokémon's capture. Thank you, Naruto said, looking down at the Pokeball. I promise to treat you well, and not misuse you. He added on, before clipping the pokeball that now contained Kyurem onto his belt. Now, he needed to meet back with Iris and Georgia, and tell them about this. It would probably warrant a freakout, but it would be worth it. Within the empty hallway, the wait felt like an eternity to Naruto. Never in his life had he felt this nervous before. Nor did he feel like the weight of the world was resting upon his shoulders. He could hear the somewhat muffled cheers, whistles, and even the conversations were leaking through, not on. Did it make the wait that much more tense, but it also made it a little uncomfortable. He knew that thousands of people were here today, in person to watch him and the battle that was to come. He knew that millions more were watching from the comfort of their own home, eagerly awaiting for what was to come. His parents were in the crowd cheering him on, possibly the most loudest in all of the stadium. He knew that Iris and Georgia, his girlfriends, were also there in person, most likely sitting side by side his parents. At least he knew that no matter what happened, whether he won or lost, they would be proud of him. He also wouldn't be surprised if people from the Village of Ice were watching from either in the stadium or from the comfort of their own village. That could also be the same for the Village of Dragons. It was a small possibility, but a part of him was hoping for it, so he could take some vindictive pleasure with knowing that the person they had banished all those years ago would get so strong. The battle itself had been something that had been heavily advertised on television programs, news articles, and even online forums weren't spared from this event. He was certain that he saw some more interesting stories being made about him for it as well. It's been so hyped up and become so popular to talk about for the past week that it had earned a new moniker, the Battle of the Decade. Sure, it might be a little exaggerated in most people's eyes, however, for the younger generation, this was probably the biggest battle that they were about to witness to date in their region. And the fame that he had received over his little run through the league and once it solidified when he defeated the Elite Four had made him into some sort of role model for the children. Never before had that been associated with him, and he wasn't sure whether to feel amazed by it, or greatly embarrassed by it either. It was possibly a double-edged sword when it came to things. It brought him celebrity status. But at the same time, it had brought him great responsibility, and if he messed up, he knew that thousands, if not millions down. Shaking his head away from those thoughts, Naruto turned his head to side and saw that his Frostlass was looking a little nervous herself, if the slight jitters that she had were anything to go by, but her eyes were shining in determination. "It's all right, Miyuki," he said softly to the floating Pokemon, petting her on the head lightly to try and reassure her. "It's okay to be nervous. I'm sure the others are as well," he said, gesturing to the Pokeballs that were safely clipped to it. He was also certain that it applied to his new companion who he caught nearly 2 months ago after an intense battle and test. It'd be the first time that he would be revealed to the world, and in a situation like that was bound to give someone or a Pokemon nervous jitters, along with a sense of pride to do the best they can, or perhaps to show off in some way. Ladies and gentlemen, Naruto felt some of his breath leave his body as his heart started pumping a million miles a minute as the announcer's voice. Closing his eyes, he tried his best to remember some techniques in order to allow himself to settle down, and feeling Frostlass' icy hands come into contact with his arm helped him. "Thank you, Miyuki," he muttered out, once again using his free hand in order to rub along Frostlass' head, earning a small, pleasured cry from her. "It's time," he muttered out once again, opening his eyes and facing Frostlass. "Are you ready for this?" he asked of her. "Lass," she cried out, nodding her head at that as she released her hold on Naruto and started to float beside him within arm's reach of him. "Good," he said, his voice tried its best to stay calm. But there was still a nervous edge to it as he bounced lightly on the balls of his feet, waiting for his moment to go walking down the tunnel and onto the battlefield. This was going to be one of the biggest battles of his life. He wasn't sure if Kyurem's test would be more challenging, or this one. "Wow, there are a lot of people here," Iris spoke out. Even though she was speaking as loudly as she possibly could, it was still extremely hard to hear over the sheer volume that this stadium was producing, either through the tense music that was playing through the speakers, or from idly cheering and chatter coming from the others. If she had to guess, there were probably at least 10,000 people in the crowd. She couldn't even see an empty chair within the stadium. "What did you expect?" It's a championship match, and there hasn't been one for nearly a decade. Georgia spoke out with some snark to her tone. Don't get her wrong, the relationship between them had gotten better. But at the same time, a little more complicated since they became sisters, so to speak, as they shared Naruto's affections. I know that. Iris yelled out in embarrassment. A slight pink dusting on her cheeks. I just didn't know it would be this crowded. Georgia rolled her eyes at the childish antics that Iris was doing. Instead, she opted to gaze at her future in-laws that were sitting just beside Iris. This is so exciting, Databane. Kushina cheered out, pumping her fist in the air, not even caring that her verbal tick had slipped out. Kushina was an extremely beautiful woman that truly didn't look her age of 39. She had fair skin, despite spending most of her time in the village of ice, and she had a slender frame, which could entice some jealousy from other women. Her hair was red in color, and luscious in health, and her hair reached down to her thighs, when it wasn't done up in a ponytail, and had two shoulder-length strands that framed her face. She also had a small black hair clip that parts her hair to the left. Her deep violet eyes were shining in happiness and excitement. It was also possible to get lost in them. Althaug. She would probably kick someone's ass that did so if it wasn't her future daughter-in-laws, future grandchildren, husband or her baby, Naruto. Her choice of clothing, whilst not ideal nor exactly something that many would go out wearing. She was content with it, as she was wearing a high-collared, sleeveless blouse under a long, loose-fitting dress that stopped just under her knees. She also had a small wristband on her left wrist for an accessory, and she was wearing simple sneakers. It wasn't a well-known fact, but Kushina had some great breasts, from what Naruto had told them, which he learnt from his father, who was a bit of a pervert, was that she had D-cup breasts. It was something that had sparked a bit of jealousy within her, as she looked down to her much more insignificant her low C-cup breasts. She hoped that they got a little bit bigger though. However, she also was glad that she wasn't a low B-cup like Iris was. Honey, calm down. It hasn't even started yet, Minato said, holding onto her shoulders and trying to bring her back down to the seat. He was concerned that if she got any more excited, then she could do something extremely stupid. Despite being at a solid age of 41, it was very likely to mistake Naruto for his father, Minato, in terms of physical appearance. As Minato had bright blue eyes that did hold some calculating glint to them, and he also had spiky blonde hair that went down to his neck at the furthest. Minato also had jaw-length bangs framing either side of his face. He did have a solid frame to him, broad shoulders, a sharp jawline and very little baby fat on him. Although, now there were a few wrinkles around his forehead. In fact, when he was wearing some looser clothing, normally for exercise, it was possible to see his pecs through the fabric. Clothing-wise, Minato was wearing something that definitely turned some heads, as he was wearing a near forest green sleeveless vest, with a black undershirt seen underneath it. He was wearing some blue trousers that had 2 lines of white tape around it, and most interestingly enough, he was wearing a white cape that had flames licking at the bottom of it, and to top it all off, he was wearing open-toed sandals, an odd choice in footwear, all things considered. Now, despite the fashion tragedy that was Minato, he did explain that his cape was made by his late mother, and the inscriptions on it were something that came from the islands of the Kanto region. It was something interesting to learn. Minato was born in the Kanto region, yet Kushina was born in the Hoenn region. Hush now. My baby is about to become champion. Kushina whooped out in joy, completely disregarding her husband as she somehow untangled her way out of his grip. Honey, the battle hasn't even started yet, Minato pointed out, flinching away ever so slightly as Kushina turned her head slowly and gave him a near withering glare. Call it a mother's intuition. I know he will become champion, she said firmly, before she gained a rather sinister smirk on her face as she rubbed her hands together. That will show the pricks that were the elders in the village of dragons. Ha, sure, she mi. GHT still hold a grudge against that village that banished her son because he bonded with an ice-type Pokemon. Lazy old coots. Minato sighed to himself, before he turned his attention towards Naruto's 2 girlfriends, something he was still proud of, and he named it the Namikaze charm, just to irk Kushina even more so. He shook his head softly at them. Sorry about this, she normally isn't like this. He spoke out with an embarrassed smile as he rubbed the back of his neck. Georgia simply waved it off. Having seen her like this on many occasions back in the Village of Ice, it was something that she grew used to seeing. Or hearing about. Don't worry about it. Naruto is much the same when he is in that sort of mood. Iris on the other hand was staring owlishly at Kushina. Never in her Fei had she seen Kushina like this. Granted, it had been years since the last time she had seen her, but this was all new to her. Ladies and gentlemen, everybody, shut up. My boy is about to come out. Kushina yelled out, her hair seemingly splitting off into 9 different strands as she glared at everyone around her, despite the fact that she was making most of the ruckus. We thank you for patience that you have shown this special occasion this evening. As the announcer's voice rang throughout the entire stadium thanks to the many speakers that were littered about the place, the audience once again broke into a mass cheer, and once again, Kushina was the one hollering the loudest, with Iris and Georgia in it a close second. Minato, although not as vocal as the women, still had a proud smile on his face as he clapped like most of the audience. Now, welcome into the arena, the champion of the Unova region, and the one who looks to defend his title, please welcome in, Alder. The announcer's voice yelled out. And on the very far left of the stadium, by the tunnel entrance, 2 massive smoke machines went off, and a few moments later, Alder came waltzing through the smoke. His strut just spoke of his confidence that he had, but the smile that he held on his face signified that he was looking forward to this match at hand. It had been a long while since he had a serious battle with a challenger. It was also safe to say that the audience volume levels absolutely blew through the roof. Everyone, no matter who they were supporting, cheered on for the champion as he made his side of the battlefight. However, to top it all off, there were a few more excited fangirls that were in the front seats, the closest to him, that were cheering their absolute hearts out with signs depicting Alder himself. And many love hearts scattered around them. As Alder made his way to his little area, he couldn't help but give a silent, hearty chuckle as he waved to everyone in the stadium, even sending a few winks towards the many females that he spotted in doing so. Now, finally, as soon as the announcer's tense voice spoke out through the speakers, it was like someone hit the mute button on the entire stadium. One could literally hear the collective intakes of breath that were taken within that moment. Our challenger, hailing from the Village of Ice, please welcome on stage, Naruto Uzumaki. Yes, show them baby. Kushina yelled out. Somehow her voice was the loudest of them all as the audience started to cheer and applaud. A man and woman, both sitting in front of her, turned around and looked at her like she grew a second head. One could almost feel the confusion that they had radiating off of them. What? She asked sharply, narrowing her eyes at the presumably married couple in front of her. That's my son. Can't a mother cheer for her gorgeous baby boy? She asked sarcastically at the end. Sorry, ma'am, the male of couple said, flashing an apologetic smile before he grabbed his spouse's shoulder and turned her around. Crazy woman, he muttered out, and his spouse nodded her head at that. Kushina pretended like she didn't hear that. On the top of the stadium's open roof, which allowed for a bird's-eye view of the battleground, sat En, with his partner Reshiram standing on the sturdy rooftop with him. Despite this being somewhat illegal didn't stop En. He found that this was the best possible seat for him to get for this battle, to witness the chosen trainer of Kyurem battle it out for the title of champion. Not only was it relatively more quite up on the roof, but the breeze was amazing as well, not so much body heat being thrown around, and of course, it allowed for his Pokémon to be able to move about freely on the rooftop, as long as they were careful, that was. But he believed them to be so. You know, Reshiram, En started, tearing his gaze away from the battlefield below and towards his partner Pokémon, who crooned in confusion, I think that this battle will be one of the best to ever be witnessed. He finished off, petting the vast white Pokémon on the top of his head once he dipped his head low enough. Who knows, maybe, just maybe, we can pick up our battling skills. En muttered out, bringing his attention back to the battlefield as the chosen trainer of Kyurem entered the fray. Our challenger, hailing from the Village of Ice. Please welcome on stage, Naruto Uzumaki. Once he heard his name get called, he took a deep breath to calm his nerves. His heart rate suddenly tripling just from hearing his name get called in a packed stadium that was there for a championship battle. He suddenly felt a hand land on his shoulder, and he turned his attention to where it came from, and he spotted one of the Supervisors that were down in this little tunnel and challenger area looking at him, an earnest smile on the suited mont's face. Knock them dead, kiddo, he said, before patting him once on the shoulder and moving a few feet away. He idly heard the beeping noise of a walkie-talkie, however, he paid that no mind. Instead, he started walking towards the massive shining light at the end of the tunnel. That was slowly filling with the smoke from the smoke machines. As soon as he exited the tunnel and was in front stadium, he felt thousands of eyes land upon his body. However, he steeled his nerve to not show an ounce of nervousness in his body posture. As he made his way up to his designated area, he noticed that the match referee was already standing in position, on his own little platform off to the side of the stadium. Then, his attention was brought to his opponent, where that fiery mane was distinguishable anywhere within the region. Naruto. Let's make this a good battle, yeah. Alder called out, his voice the only thing being able to be heard for Naruto despite the thunderous cheering all around him. You bet. Naruto replied back, showing some of his confidence that had manifested for this very moment. Are both sides ready? The official match referee called out, his voice being amplified by the small microphone headset that he was wearing. Naruto merely gave a small nod of the head, whilst Alder gave the man a thumbs-up gesture. Alder, send out your first Pokemon. The referee called out, raising his left hand which held an orange flag. Certainly. Alder said, nodding his head and taking a Pokeball off of his nifty little necklace. Escavalier, assistance required. He called out, throwing his Pokeball in the air and revealing the first Pokemon of the battle. As the Pokemon was revealed as the reddish light finally died down, Naruto was able to see it for the first time. Escavalier is an insectoid Pokemon with a head sporting the red horsehair crest of a knight's helmet, with a visor underneath it. Its shoulders have large, round metal ridges, from which its thin black arms extend. The arms are tipped with red striped protrusions resembling jousting lances. Its face and torso are bare of armor. But its lower body is concealed within a swirled gray shell with a red spike on the underside. The referee nodded his head at that, briefly glancing up at the massive broadcasting screen that briefly swapped to the image of Alder and Naruto. The first Pokeball under Alder brightened up, to reveal the image of Escavalier. Challenger, reveal your Pokemon. The referee called out, raising his hand, in which a green flag was shown. Naruto nodded his head at that, before glancing towards Frostlass, who was floating beside him, and had a stern expression of determination and concentration upon her features. I'll save you until later, is that alright? He questioned her, not wanting her to be upset, but he wouldn't lie in saying that he was his most important piece to the battle. And not his newly acquired legendary. Lass. Seeing her agree to his little offer, he sighed in relief, before a blank expression overcame him, before he reached for the Pokeball that held Kyurem within. He knew that it might be a bit stupid to reveal him right now, but he wanted a small shock factor to be thrown into the mix, to make things more exciting. I hope you are ready, Kyurem, he thought to himself, before throwing the Pokeball in the air and giving a shout of, Kyurem, I choose you. As the legendary Pokemon made its appearance on the battlefield, the were sharp gasps of surprise and even fear from the audience. However, Naruto took no heed to it, even as Alder stumbled where he was standing at the sight of the legendary Pokemon before him. However, he too soon overcame that. And his expression seemed to gain that much more excitement. That's it for today, I will stop here. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you please consider subscribe and make sure to hit that like button, share with your friends, and don't forget to check out my Patreon. Details in description.